Addiction. One of the biggest fears, individually and societally, from the use of drugs is the risk of addiction. The term drug addicts is a stigmatizing title often applied to anyone who uses a drug, but is this fair or even accurate? In order to answer that question, we really need to define what we mean by addiction. Colloquially, we often use the term addiction to mean really liking to do something. I'm addicted to this new computer game, or I have a chocolate addiction. But when researchers or clinicians speak about addiction, they mean something a little more specific. Broadly speaking, a behaviour could be considered to be an addiction when an individual changes their life to fit around the consumption of a particular drug. It's not necessarily the quantity of the drug consumed, or even the regularity of use that would define a problem, but the way that use impacts on your life. Two people could drink the same amount of alcohol and find it impacts on their life in completely different ways. And what changes a compulsion into an addiction is the potential for the compulsion to cause an individual harm. Without this harm, if a person is regularly or heavily using a substance, you might say they had a dependency on it, or potentially not even that. Maybe they simply get enjoyment from regular use of it. Of everyone who tries a drug, from coffee to heroin, LSD to cannabis, MDMA to alcohol, many, if not the majority of people, will not become addicted to it. This is true even of heroin, a substance where many think that addiction is inevitable. Addiction rates are hard to estimate, although they seem to be higher than for many other substances, but still lower than most people would estimate if asked. Of course, there are other harms from heroin than just addiction, but the myth that you need to only try it once to become dependent on it is simply not true. There is only one substance where a large majority of people who try it will go on to develop addiction, and that is tobacco, specifically cigarettes, where a recent systematic review suggested that around 60% of individuals who try a cigarette will become daily smokers, even if only for a short amount of time. Caffeine is also a substance where the majority of people who use caffeine regularly will experience withdrawal when they stop, although whether this is truly addiction is contested, as caffeine does not cause harm, or certainly not to the same degree as cigarettes, alcohol or heroin, and therefore it may be more accurate to say people have caffeine dependence. Perhaps these substances have a higher level of dependence because they are legal and therefore easily available, although the same is true for alcohol, where addiction does occur but not to such a high degree. Around 15% of drinkers will develop problematic alcohol use behaviours. Why do some people become addicted to substances? It used to be thought that addiction, or certainly drug dependency, was fairly straightforward. A person used a substance repeatedly, and their body and/or brain became tolerant to the substance, requiring more and more of it to maintain function. This concept of addiction suggested that treatment was simple. Stop taking the substance and allow the brain and body to return to their pre-addicted state. But there are several ways in which this is oversimplistic. For a start, it doesn't explain why some people, the majority of people in fact, can use a substance and not develop addiction. We know a bit about how drugs affect the brain. They impact on the chemicals that transmit signals between brain cells, the neurotransmitters. Some have suggested that addiction might develop because substances alter the chemical balance of our brain by impacting on those neurotransmitters. Potentially, regular consumption of a substance that mimics a specific neurotransmitter might lead to the brain creating or releasing less of it, which could be unpleasant, and lead an individual to take more of the drug to top up their levels. One neurotransmitter in particular has been associated with addiction, a chemical called dopamine. There is a pathway within our brains often referred to as the dopamine reward pathway, and activation through this path is linked to, as you might guess, reward, as well as things like pleasure and enjoyment. As such, this pathway is strongly linked to addiction, and is often seen activated or implicated in brain scan studies of people with drug dependence. But it's also been shown to be linked to other things we might really enjoy doing, such as eating delicious food, watching our favourite TV shows, or having sex. Are we addicted to these things? I'd argue not, apart from in extremely rare cases, suggesting that dopamine and the dopamine reward pathway's involvement might be a little more nuanced than we think. It seems like there's something else above and beyond brain chemical changes that leads to addiction. The biopsychosocial model of addiction. A landmark study that has influenced theories of addiction was conducted by Lee Robbins, a psychiatric epidemiologist from Louisiana, USA. It was well documented that American troops in Vietnam showed unusually high levels of drug use while deployed, In particular, they were using heroin or opium, with around 35% of US soldiers using heroin, and 20% showing signs of dependence on it. Robbins followed up a group of veterans when they returned from Vietnam to the USA in 1971, and found that although some continued to use drugs on their return, around 10% reported having used heroin in the 8 to 12 months since they returned from Vietnam. The vast majority stopped using heroin as soon as they were back in their home communities, and fewer than 1% of her sample reported becoming re-addicted after returning home. This study implied that a person's circumstances can strongly impact on their ability to avoid or succumb to addiction. Robbins didn't stop at collecting the numbers. She also asked the men in her sample why they didn't carry on using heroin once they had returned to the USA. Most reported that it was easy to obtain it where they lived, but they did not continue to use it because of factors such as fear of addiction, disapproval of family and friends, and fear of arrest. This certainly supports the idea that the environment in which they found themselves, a war zone far from home versus their own community, was able to override any biological impact of the substance. Robbins's work strongly supports a model of addiction where the substance is important, but so is the environment a person is in, their personal circumstances, and even their personality. This is known as the biopsychosocial model of addiction, stressing the importance of biology, psychological factors, and social circumstance. This model suggests that some people are likely to be particularly vulnerable to developing dependence for a variety of reasons, and this is backed up by research evidence. Likelihood to experience addiction runs in families. If your parents or siblings struggle with their substance use, you are more inclined to do so as well. This may be genetic, or it could be environmental, and in reality it's probably a bit of both. Socioeconomic status also predicts risk of addiction. If your life is more challenging, maybe you're more likely to use a substance to cope with that, which can lead to problematic use. Or perhaps people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds are still experiencing problems but can better access support and treatment due to their circumstances. Personality-wise, impulsivity seems to be linked to a risk of developing problematic substance use, but as with all these factors, it's not necessary or sufficient. Each of these factors might tip the scales, and there are probably a load of other risk factors for addiction that we're not yet aware of. A similar finding is that of Rat Park. Rat Park was an experiment conducted in the late 1970s in Canada by a man called Bruce K. Alexander. At this time, most research into models of addiction was conducted on rodents. For the most part, these animals were kept isolated in small cages, and researchers such as Alexander were beginning to wonder whether the lack of environmental stimulation might be impacting on the research. The way the findings of Rat Park are presented in popular culture often goes something like this. Alexander found that rats in cages in his psychology department would self-administer morphine at high levels. The rats were kept in small metal cages, isolated from each other and from pretty much any stimulation at all. The only thing they really saw were the psychologists who fed them and occasionally made them do a water maze or some other experiment. So Alexander built Rat Park, a large cage complex where multiple rats were housed, with room to roam, levels to explore, and all manner of stimulation. He found that rats in this environment were far less likely to self-administer morphine and were more likely to drink plain water. As an aside, this is actually a quote from myself. I wrote this in the proposal for this very book. Since then, I've written an article for the journal Addiction as part of their Classics series about Rat Park, which led me to thoroughly read the original papers. I was quite shocked at just how different the public perception of the research is from what Alexander and his colleagues actually did. When you go back to the original Rat Park papers published between 1978 and 1981, the story is a little less dramatic. While Alexander and his co-authors did indeed find a difference in morphine-laced water consumption between the rats in Rat Park and those in isolated cages, this was only in very specific circumstances. Firstly, in the initial study, the rats in all conditions barely touched the morphine water to begin with. In order to get them to consume it, they were all given no choice but to consume it. Their other water was taken away for over 50 days. This part of the experiment was so extreme that 4 female rats died during it, 2 who were in Rat Park and 2 who were in isolation. This left a very small sample size indeed. Only 2 females and 6 males were left in isolation, and 8 females and 12 males in Rat Park. The 2 isolated females consumed way more morphine water than any of the other groups of rats, driving the difference between isolation and Rat Park. There were some other slightly strange things about the way the experiment was run as well. The way water and morphine consumption was measured was different between the two groups. In Rat Park, a complicated system involving cameras and laser beams was set up. In isolation, the rats' water bottles were weighed at the beginning and end of each day. If there was some systematic difference in error rate between these two ways of measuring, that would show a difference between the groups even if one didn't exist. The fact that the difference was particularly striking in the female rats may also be important. Rats in Rat Park weren't separated by sex. As such, it's extremely likely that there were rat babies. The pregnancy and weaning of rat pups may have impacted on the female rats in Rat Park's behaviour, making them less comparable to those in isolation. All this isn't to say that the findings of Rat Park aren't important. Many other studies have also found that environment, set and setting can have a big impact on these kind of animal studies, and it's widely accepted that this biopsychosocial model of addiction, where biology, psychology and social setting all impact on a person's likelihood to develop problematic substance use, is important to understanding human behaviour. But as is so often the case when studies like Rat Park seem to be just so stories, if it seems as if the findings are too good to be true, they probably are. Stigma. There's another factor that might make addiction more difficult for an individual and harder to break out of, and that's stigma. There's an alarming amount of evidence that suggests that drug use is something viewed as immoral and deviant by large swathes of the planet. This is true individually and at governmental and higher levels. When the United Nations published their international treaty in 1961, the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs, they referred to addiction to drugs as a serious evil for the individual and fraught with social and economic danger to mankind. Quite extreme language. India's Supreme Court went further still in 2003, declaring that offences that related to drugs were worse than murder because the latter affects only an individual while the former affects society, besides shattering the economy of the nation. Surveys conducted across the world have shown that people often have negative views of those who use substances. In 2016, a survey conducted in Scotland on public attitudes towards people with drug dependence found that 42% of respondents believed that drug dependence was due to a lack of self-discipline and willpower, pinning the blame firmly on the individual. Research conducted in North Africa and the Middle East asked individuals to describe people who inject drugs. The most commonly used terms in response were should be punished, evil/mean persons, disrespected/disrespectful, and guilty. A 1998 USA survey asked people to select words or phrases that described a person who uses cocaine. The most commonly selected were no future, lazy, and self-centered. How we refer to someone impacts on how they are perceived and treated, even among healthcare professionals who might be those to whom these individuals would go to for help. A study in the USA gave mental health clinicians a vignette about a person, but these vignettes were slightly tweaked. Some people read vignettes with neutral language, while others read about addicts who were problem drug users. Where the language used was more pejorative, these clinicians were more likely to believe that the individual was responsible for their situation. Not only that, but they also endorsed more punitive measures towards the individual. So while it might seem awkward or unnecessarily PC to use overly long descriptions such as people who inject drugs or people with problematic substance use, rather than terms like junkie or addict, it's really important to do so. Language matters, and there's a real risk that individuals who do experience problems with their substance use will be less likely to seek help or to get the help that they need if they're stigmatized for their situation. Nobody starts using drugs with the intention of becoming addicted or dependent on them. And while, as indicated by both Rat Park and the Vietnam Veteran Study, a person's circumstances can increase the risk that occasional use will turn into regular use, and in turn on to problematic use and potentially addiction, there are other factors at play. Equally, while we know that certain brain regions play a role in addiction and addictive behaviours, presenting addiction as purely a brain disease might be counterproductive. It could imply to those who are beginning to move down this path towards problematic use that there's little they can do about it, which might lead to feelings of helplessness and an inability to take action to improve. Although conversely, it could give those who believe they don't have an addictive personality a false sense of security about their drug taking, as they might believe themselves immune to the risk of dependence. Risk factors for addiction are both nature and nurture. It is likely that some people have a higher innate risk of developing addiction based on their genetic makeup, but if they never try a substance, this increased risk won't have any effect. Similarly, lots of environmental influences can play a role. A difficult childhood, trouble at work or at home, all sorts of things. But plenty of people will really struggle in their lives and not then develop problems with drug use. It's complicated, and at the moment, while we know at a population level some of the factors that increase the risk of addiction, we can't predict which individuals will develop dependence or addiction. Drug use in the real world. This book is about the science of various different substances. It's about what we know and don't know about the chemical compound MDMA and its effect on people, or heroin, or any of the other substances detailed in the book. But drug use, particularly illicit drug use, does not necessarily follow these neat classifications. If you buy a white powder or a chalky tablet from someone you know, from a stranger at a festival, even over the internet, you're really buying a lottery ticket. There are no consumer rights for illicit drugs. While pharmaceutical substances have to be created under very strict conditions in sterile environments and to high-quality standards, illicit drugs that are synthesized or even just packaged in underground labs are subject to none of these. They might be prepared by amateurs, in bulk, in unhygienic or dirty environments. And there's absolutely no guarantee that what you're purchasing contains what you think it does, or doesn't contain something else that could potentially cause you unexpected harms, or a dose far greater than what you're expecting. While each chapter in this book focuses predominantly on the harms from a specific known substance, it's vital to be aware that there are additional risks when a person takes a powder, a tablet, or a liquid. There are specific things that people who decide to take a drug can do to minimize those harms, although as I've said throughout the book, no drug use is without harm. Is it the substance you think it is? A white powder or a nondescript tablet could contain many things. Unfortunately, there's no way to be fully sure that what you're taking is what you think it is. This can put people at serious risk of harm. As an example, in the early 2010s, a substance called PMA was being sold in the UK and around Europe as MDMA, and it put seasoned MDMA users in danger. PMA takes longer than MDMA for intoxication to begin. Not only that, but it has a smaller window of efficacy. You only need to take slightly more of it to tip from the sought-after intoxication experience into overdose and unpleasant or dangerous toxicity. People who were used to taking MDMA would take PMA, wait until they expected to feel something, and then, assuming they had a low-potency batch of MDMA, take more and push themselves into toxicity. Although PMA is less commonly being sold as MDMA nowadays, these types of substitutions are common and have happened with MDMA throughout its illicit history. The Drug Policy Alliance report on their website that MDMA has been found containing synthetic cathinones, amphetamine, cocaine, caffeine, and less commonly ketamine, or dextromethorphan, an ingredient found in cough medicines. One online drug testing company published data on MDMA samples sent to them in 2015. Of 250 samples, 124 did not contain MDMA, and 40 contained MDMA and one of the substances mentioned above. This is not only a problem for MDMA. Heroin has been tested and found to be laced with the substantially more potent opioid fentanyl. There's no way to tell this by looking at the sample, and if a person injected what they thought was a standard dose of heroin, they would be at high risk of severe harm or even death from fentanyl overdose. Fentanyl has also been found disguised as the benzodiazepine Xanax. There are things you can do to reduce the risk from unknown substances. It's possible to buy drug testing kits online, but these will only test for specific substances. If the powder or tablet contains anything else, it won't pick this up, and it might not be able to tell you the strength of the dose either. In recent years and in certain countries, drug testing on site at music festivals or in city centres is beginning to become more common, although at the time of writing this is still quite rare. These services can not only provide information to individuals, but can also provide public information, for example about high-potency tablets in local circulation, or adulterated pills that contain harmful unexpected substances. However, even these sites, particularly when in the festival field, can only test for certain contents and will not necessarily be able to tell you every single substance in your powder or tablet. They'll be able to tell you exactly what they can and can't tell you about your sample, should you have the need to use their services. Is it the dose you think it is? As has been detailed in some of the specific chapters in this book, a powder or a tablet can hide secrets about the concentration of the substance it contains, even if it is what you think it is. This is also the case for substances where the psychoactive compound has been sprayed onto plant-based material, and even substances like cannabis, where the levels of THC can vary dramatically between plants and different preparations of cannabis. Not only that, but a suitable dose of any substance is a very individual matter, affected by your genetics, your biological sex, what you've eaten that day, even your mood. This can be clearly seen with alcohol. If I tried to drink 10 pints, I would be extremely ill, whereas some friends of mine can do this easily and even be able to function adequately the next day. There are steps that you can take to avoid the risk of overdosing on a substance. The first is to try what is called titration. This means starting with a very low dose and gradually increasing the dose until you find a point where the sought-after effects outweigh the unwanted side effects. This is how doctors might work out a correct dose of medication, and it's far less risky than just starting with the dose you think might work and hoping for the best. If you're taking a powder or pill, harm reduction advice is to crush dab weight, which means taking a small amount of the powder or crushed pill and dab a licked finger into it, take that and wait for an hour or two before deciding whether to take more. This advice was in response to high-purity MDMA crystals being in circulation, which people were consuming whole and experiencing unpleasant intoxication or overdose symptoms. Another slogan is, "Don't be daft, start with a half," which concerns MDMA tablets. In recent years, these have been increasing in potency, some being found to contain 4 times the level found in tablets a decade ago. Taking illicit drugs is more dangerous today than it's ever been. While I was finalising the edits to this book in August 2019, the UK's Office for National Statistics published their latest report about drug-related deaths in England and Wales. The deaths reported in 2018 where drugs were mentioned on the death certificates. And it made for pretty sobering reading. Drug poisoning deaths are at the highest levels they've been since the data started being collected in 1993. ONS reported that 4,359 individuals died in 2018 due to drug poisoning in England and Wales. In particular, there were rises in deaths from people using cocaine, the data combined powder cocaine and crack cocaine, opioids, in particular heroin and morphine, amphetamine, and benzodiazepines. The National Crime Agency reported that cocaine that has been seized recently is at what they described as historically high purity levels, which could be one explanation for why deaths from cocaine have increased substantially. The drug death situation is even worse in Scotland, where 1,187 deaths were reported last year, ranking it as a country with one of the highest rates of drug-related deaths globally. The reasons why drug deaths are increasing are likely to be complicated, relating to purity, the closure of drug treatment and support services, austerity politics, and all sorts of other factors. Public Health England have identified risk factors for drug-related deaths, which include people who use many different drugs and alcohol, people who consume drugs while they're alone, and people who live alone. What can be done? The research community in the UK was quite vocal about this in the wake of these figures being published. Harm reduction strategies need to be prioritised. Funding that has been cut to support services needs to be reinstated, and consideration of the complex needs of the people most at risk from drug-related death needs to be at the forefront of any policies. This is only likely to happen with public support, but drug use, and particularly drug dependence, is still heavily stigmatised. The more we can humanise people who use drugs, the more compassionate we can be, the more likely we are to see a change in how people are treated, and hopefully a change in the direction of the ONS's graphs. Many people listening to this book will be doing so out of curiosity, and will perhaps have tried 1 or 2 of the substances I've described. I would not encourage anyone to take any of the substances mentioned here. No drug use is without the risk of harm. This is true of illicit drugs, and it's true of licit ones. I'm sure some people listening to this are parents, concerned as to what is out there that their child might be tempted to try. For you, I hope this book can help you start conversations that can be based on evidence-based information and the principles of harm reduction. Some people will have started listening because they've tried many of the substances detailed. For you, I hope you have found it an interesting trip. We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Say Why to Drugs by Dr. Suzi Gage.